Welcome to Heat Checks and Hail Marys. This is Mike Cagley. The craziest season in years started the final weekend with a barn burner of a game. On Friday night, it took Georgia 8 overtimes to defeat a 7-5 Georgia Tech team from the ACC. Apparently, the ACC isn't as weak as we were led to believe. All the while, of course, as this game was going on, ESPN jumped into influencer mode by proclaiming Georgia as being guaranteed a CFP bid if they beat Georgia Tech. Just like in other areas of broadcasting, it'd be nice if there was a conflict of interest notice when a network tries to manipulate opinions in favor of one of their own programming properties. But we all know that's not going to happen. Of course, there were a few other excellent games and a few other upsets this weekend. The biggest was the loss of number 2 Ohio State to an unranked Michigan team, followed by Miami losing. Clemson also lost. And of course, Texas A&M lost, but they lost to the number 3 Texas Longhorns, although it was a home game for the Aggies. Next weekend, the conference title games look like they will be a ton of fun. I am really more curious to see what happens for the losers of these conference title games. How will they be handled by the committee? Is it better to play an extra game and lose? Or is it better to stay home like Alabama and Indiana and not play and hope to see if you can get a lift when others are defeated? Now let's move to Hail Mary number 1, Ryan Day and Ohio State. Now, Ryan Day's record as the head coach of the Buckeyes stands at 66-10. Ohio State is the only head coaching job he's had. Now, that's improbable, but we know that sometimes that can happen when you get an assistant coach moved up to coach the number 1 brand, arguably, in the country. Now, Day's losses had all been to teams that were ranked number 12 and better. But now he's lost to an unranked team, and even worse than that, it was an unranked Michigan team. To make it even worse for Ohio State, this was the 4th loss in a row to the Wolverines, and it's also the 4th loss to the Wolverines when the Buckeyes were ranked number 2 in the country and the higher ranked team. Now, there's no sin with the losses that Ryan Day has. You can see them right there. Impressive record. And there are very few coaches who would be questioned after losing 10 games over the course of 6+ years as a head coach. But Ryan Day, he's a special case because he's the coach of the Ohio State Buckeyes, where sky-high expectations are a way of life for the program. He's never had another job as a head coach, so he's got no experience in bringing a team back from the precipice. If you want to compare to somebody, compare to Urban Meyer, who built a program at Bowling Green, built a program at Utah, rebuilt a program at Florida, won a national title, then underachieved and won another national title before ever showing up at Ohio State. Ryan Day has also lost 4 in a row to Ohio State's most hated foe in what could be the biggest rivalry in college football. And some say it might be the biggest rivalry in all of U.S. sports. And of course, Ryan Day hasn't won a national title. So those 4 factors are really important in the pressure that he's under right now. Clearly, Ryan Day's done a good job at Ohio State University, but the biggest boosters can't be happy with a coach who seems to be emulating John Cooper, the Ohio State head coach who was 2 10-1 versus Michigan. Now, Buckeye fans wonder what would have been if their school had moved away from Cooper sooner rather than later. Now, it's fair to ask, is athletic director Ross Bjork, is he thinking about making a move and getting a coach that he chose? The post-game press conference of Ryan Day was obviously a highly emotional moment, and it's not totally fair to judge somebody based on that soon after such a huge loss. This press conference was just minutes after that loss and the on-field clash with a Michigan team, which, to be honest, is a different subject. And there's clearly a habit that is formed for Michigan teams involving poor behavior post game and sometimes in the middle of games, which seems to be enabled by an athletic department that just doesn't care. But that's a subject for another podcast. When I watched Ryan Day at the press conference, he looks like a beaten man. Will he be able to circle the wagons and get the Ohio State Buckeyes to place in the CFP like the $20 million team they were expected to be? I don't know what will happen in the future. At the end of the season, maybe a change will happen. I can guarantee you that in a worst case scenario, Ryan Day would be a very in demand offensive coordinator because a lot of head coaches won't be fired this year because it's too expensive in terms of NIL funds that might need to be used for high priced buyouts. So Ryan Day will be fine whether he's the head coach of the Ohio State Buckeyes next year or not. But what about this year? There's still a few weeks before the next game. My what if is what if Ross played 100% riverboat gambler and he decided to roll the dice, fire Ryan Day, and call Urban Meyer to take over the team and try to straighten things out. Certainly, the Buckeyes are uber talented, and with Urban Meyer leading the way, they might even be the odds on favorite to win another national championship. Now, realistically speaking, my guess is we'll never know what would happen in that situation. Now, let's move on to Hail Mary number 2, the Illinois High School Association playoff structure for football. On Friday, 4 state championship football games from Class 1A to 4A, featuring teams without geographic enrollment boundaries. Let's just call them no boundaries when I'm talking about those teams, competing against schools with geographic enrollment boundaries. We're talking about private schools versus public schools, and public schools have geographic enrollment boundaries. But the result in every case was that the geographically limited schools were blown out. Now, I didn't even keep track of Saturday's game to motivate me to write about this issue, but it didn't get a lot better on Saturday. But let's dig down a little deeper. 2 of the geographically limited schools, Lena Winslow and Monticello, have head coaches with records that have a combined almost 500 wins. And each coach has multiple state championships. So this was not a case of the small town Hicks being exploited by the bigger private schools with bigger coaching staffs. This was 2 fantastic coaches who are very good at what they do. No, this was a case of with a team with geographic boundaries having roster gaps that teams with no boundaries were able to close. Simply put, the no boundary teams have a larger population to draw upon to acquire players. Now, whether a player pays a fee to play for these teams is irrelevant. By being borderless, these teams inherently have more opportunities to attract, recruit, and acquire players to construct a better and deeper roster. And they don't have to go through any process, real or not, of having players move to a location within their school district to make it all work out because they don't have limits or borders to their school district. For perspective, let's consider how much of a chance the Fighting Illini would have to beat Notre Dame if the Fighting Irish could recruit from the entire United States, while Illinois could only draw from players hailing from the state of Illinois. As bad as the Illini have fared in the past against Notre Dame in football, does anyone like their chances in the scenario I just outlined? It would be even worse. And that's saying something. For the record, the Fighting Illini are 0-11-1 against Notre Dame, and the Illini have only scored in double digits one time. I am recommending looking at 4 alternatives to solve this issue equitably. Now, maybe one of these alternatives will trigger an even better idea from the minds of individuals who are smarter than I am. Maybe there's a way to merge a couple of these together to get a good idea. The fact of the matter is that there needs to be something done. This has drug on forever in the state of Illinois. And as I tweeted about it, I found multiple states where the same thing is happening, according to people who responded to my tweet. And all 4 of these proposals could be augmented by having a varsity player transfer review board. These individuals could look at the circumstances around any player transferring from one school to another to play a varsity sport. Texas does something similar to this right now. The downside of this, of course, is that it does put a lot of power in the state sports athletic association, and they haven't done a ton to really make people feel like that's deserved. So let's talk about proposal number 1. Proposal number 1 is use data analysis to determine the population base of school districts by zip code. Instead of using enrollment in the actual high school to stack rank from the bottom to the most largest schools, instead, the schools could be ranked by the population base that they draw upon instead. The school districts could be ranked from top to bottom and divided into 8 classes, just as they are today. A no boundaries school would simply add the population of all the zip codes that the players live in to get a total number. For example, a team with players from 7 zip codes would add the population associated with those 7 zip codes. That would determine their population base. This would provide differentiation from teams with geographic boundaries that are limited to fewer zip codes. With many teams limited to just one zip code, certainly if a no boundaries school didn't want to bring in a player due to their population base growing too much, that's the type of choice they would make in a system like this. Let's talk about proposal number 2. This is an enrollment-based approach whereby the school enrollment for schools with geographic boundaries would still be used, just as they are today. For no boundary schools, their enrollment would be determined by where they pull the players from. Their enrollment would be determined by the school with the highest enrollment that one of their players resides in. For example, if a no boundaries school pulled a player from the geographic boundary of a high school that has an enrollment of 2,000 students, and that is the largest school that a player resides in, then the enrollment of 2,000 students would determine where that no boundaries school competes in the postseason. A similar system is used in Texas. Proposal number 3. This is an enrollment based approach as well. Like number 2, the existing school enrollment for schools with geographic boundaries would still be used. No boundaries schools would determine their enrollment by adding up the enrollments of the schools that their players reside in. So, in this example, if a no boundaries school pulled players from the geographic boundaries of 5 schools and they have a total enrollment of 3,000, then when it was time to determine where this school is slotted in the playoffs, they would be considered to have an enrollment of 3,000 students. And proposal number 4, probably the easiest one, is to maintain in the state of Illinois the 8 classes of football championships. But you would have 6 classes for schools with geographic boundaries. So, in a sense, you would almost go back to the old 6-class system for public schools. And you would have 2 classes for the no boundaries schools. So, you'd have a big school and a small school class. This would mean no additional championships. Nothing really changes. It just divides the public schools who have boundaries with the private schools that don't have them. I listed those ideas as a start. I'm not claiming that any of those is a solution that solves all the world's problems, but they certainly would be a start and provide different ideas to bat around in hopes of trying to find a solution. I'm not claiming these ideas are perfect, that any one of them is a magic bullet. But with 4 ideas, there should be discussion points and ways to flesh out each of these ideas that may improve them and may provide a solution for what ails what is going on in the football side of it. If you wanted to apply these to other sports, I would leave that to people who follow those sports a little bit more closely to see if that makes sense. It very well might. But the bottom line is, instead of just complaining about a problem that most people can clearly see, why not start to try to find a solution? There are ways to address the inequities that resulted in Friday's annihilations. And there's really no reason not to at least explore options to solve those problems. Is there the collective will to make those changes? I don't know. And it's not as easy as everybody says, as the IHSA probably doesn't want to have a competing private school organization grow up if they were to split. So there are nuances on this. There's probably not a lot of bad guys, but if you want to have a better game on the field, this needs to be addressed. Now let's move on to Hail Mary number 3. We've got the Big Ten team tiers, the final rankings. I don't know if it'll change too much over conference championship week. And to be honest with you, the CFP could change something, but bowls have become largely practices with players sitting out to go to the NFL. The regular season is done, and the Big Ten has 12 of its 18 teams eligible for bowling or the CFP. That's a heck of a year. And they're hoping for 4 in the CFP, which would most likely beat out the SEC, who looks like 3 may be what they're getting. But the SEC will have 13 of its 16 teams eligible for the postseason. The fact that Wisconsin and Maryland aren't bowling is a bit of a surprise based on preseason expectations, and both schools must be a little bit concerned in this era of NIL warfare. But let's take a look at my final rankings for the Big Ten. Now, in Tier 1, Oregon's all by themselves. I didn't think this was going to happen, but the Buckeyes were decked by the Wolverines, and fell into Tier 2 for the first time this season. Oregon earned it, and I guess we can say that they adapted to the Big Ten just fine. And Nebraska and Penn State and Maryland are, what did we do wrong? Because Oregon came in and went undefeated. Give the Ducks kudos for that. Tier 2, I still have Ohio State number 2. Now, I may be proven wrong in the ensuing weeks. Penn State's number 3 and Indiana's number 4. The Buckeyes are going to have to prove my faith. By a long run by the Buckeyes would certainly make the regular season losses a little less painful, although no Buckeye fan will forget the loss to Michigan. Despite this rough weekend, I still think Ohio State has more talent than Penn State or Indiana, but Penn State's got the shot now. They can potentially beat Oregon and jump into Tier 1. Indiana certainly took care of business and took care of Ryan Walters' regime at Purdue and hope to make its way to the CFP as well. If they don't make it there, it'll be a real shame because Curt Cignetti should be the coach of the year across the nation. And what he's done there, winning double-digit games for the first time in the history of Hoosier football, is nothing short of incredible. Tier 3, I have Illinois at number 5, Iowa number 6, and Minnesota at number 7. Welcome back to the Big Ten West, everybody. Illinois earned its first 9-win season since 2007. Brett Bielema has the Illini moving up, and quite frankly, Illinois is in its best shape since John Makovich was the head coach back in the early 90s. Iowa won its 8th game in uniquely Iowa fashion with 5 first downs and 164 yards of offense. Nobody else does that. The Golden Gophers, they made sure Wisconsin didn't go bowling with a win in Madison. PJ Fleck has to feel fantastic about that. Tier 4, I have Michigan at 8, Rutgers at 9, USC at 10, Nebraska at 11, and Washington at 12. All these teams are bowl eligible, and all these teams are inconsistent. Michigan became world beaters by going into Columbus and wrecking Ohio State's plans for revenge on Oregon in the Big Ten championship game. And they ruined my prediction of Oregon and Ohio State playing 3 times this year. So thanks, Michigan. Rutgers fought off major injury issues, and it's hard to really look down at their season when you consider all the roster issues they had to deal with. USC may have been the most disappointing team in the conference, with extremely high preseason expectations that weren't lived up to. Nebraska finally makes it back to a bowl, the first since 2016, and Matt Rule has to be happy that he doesn't have to hear about can they win the game that gets them into a bowl anymore. He didn't create that monster, but he did slay it. Washington's anemic offense was excusable after losing its head coach to Alabama, and we expect more from them in the future. Tier 5, Wisconsin I had at 13, Michigan State at 14, and UCLA at 15. Luke Fickell's first 2 years have not played out the way Wisconsin fans would like. Next year is a key for his long-term success in Madison. He's going to have to get things done because these fans, some of them remember what it was like pre-Barry Alvarez when Wisconsin stunk, and they do not want to go back. And as an Illini fan who remembers what it used to be great in football, I don't blame them one bit. Michigan State was expected to be a cellar dweller. So this finish is actually pretty good for the future of Spartan football. Jonathan Smith has done well this year. And UCLA finished 4-2 to make up for a putrid 1-5 start to the season. There's plenty of hope in Bruin land as well. At Tier 6, Northwestern is at 16, Maryland is at 17, and Purdue is at 18. Northwestern's dealing with a talent drop-off after Fitzgerald's resignation. This team needs an influx of talent, and certainly they're building a stadium. One would think that some of the NIL money would start coming in to help that stadium be kicked off by a team that's fairly good, but that's still a we'll see. Maryland has underachieved mightily, was right there with USC, and this season is going to be a real challenge on the recruiting trail. It is very tough in this new world to stumble and fall in football season. And Purdue, they're at the bottom all by themselves. So much so that the job of head coach Ryan Walters is no longer. Now, we don't revel in people losing their job. The good thing is, it appears that Ryan will get the $9.5 million of buyout, and he will probably be an incredibly in demand defensive coordinator because he is very good at his job. And a lot of teams will not want to pay buyouts because then you have to rob your NIL kitty or your boosters to pay those buyouts. So there may be a market for good defensive coordinators. It may be the perfect timing for a guy like Ryan Walters to cash a big check and have good employment. So there's where the Big Ten ended up this season. It could get some tweaks. We will see. Now it's up to the Big Ten to perform well in the CFP and, if possible, in bowl games. Here we are. We are going to do Hail Mary number 4, which is what a high school coach and athletic director might think of a few of these playoff structure proposals. Of course, fellow Illini guy Brad Sturdy's on, and he is both of those things, along with a lot of other roles that he plays. Brad, the thing that fired me up, and this is, it's not that this is a new problem that I've just discovered,
Yeah.
but on Saturday, we had arguably two of the probably top 20 coaches in the state of Illinois got annihilated. The coach of Lena Winslow, of course, multiple state titles, and a team that is competitive pretty much every game they play. And then Monticello, which is Cully Welter, who's actually 2 years younger than me from Mahomet, who has multiple state titles, I think 4 maybe, and at multiple schools. Both those guys together, I think they're right at, if you add their wins together, they're both approaching 250 wins each. So this was not a fact that the 1A and 3A games were being out coached. So that was what made me get fired up about why we have schools that don't have boundaries playing against schools that are limited by geographic boundaries and thus population that they can pull from in these games. And boy, it was just a rugged day because it was 4-0 for those schools with no boundaries.
Yeah, and then you look at the second day, right? 5A was both. You had 2 different places, and then 7A and 8A both went the way. You had 2 publics in 6A, East St. Louis, I guess they count. But so here's the deal with football is one of those sports that almost all of these schools, even the ones who win a lot, they have there's a lot of recruiting that goes on, a lot of behind the scenes stuff that happens. So it's clear that it's not an equitable playing setup. What I don't understand is the IHSA implemented the multiplier effect years ago of a 1.65 times the enrollment, but they give everybody waivers. So it's pointless unless you meet a certain standard of winning. You don't have to use the waiver. So so I don't know. It's just bizarre what the point is, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to keep doing the things the way they're doing it. So they need to come up with a better system. There are a few different options out there, but yeah, you've got some here. So let's hear.
The first one was instead of using enrollments, use population to determine the playoff classes. Both the schools that have no boundaries, i.e., the private, and the schools that have boundaries use the zip codes of where their players live, and you take the population of those zip codes and you add them up, and that gets you the total populations. If, for example, you have a team that is from a town with one zip code and they may have 3,000 people to draw from. And if you have somebody who has people from 7 different zip codes, you would need to add those zip codes up to see what their total population is. And then you would just stack all the teams that are eligible for the playoffs, and the ones with the whatever it is 64 biggest populations are 8A, and the 64 lowest are 1A. And that means that if you have a fullback who's coming from 2 hours away from a big city, then that's going to add to the population, and you can stack a team, but you also might find yourself looking across the way at a team like Normal Community if you're in Central Illinois in 7A, or one of the big schools up in Chicago in 8A if you drew from enough zip codes.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Sangamo Conference actually had a proposal that wasn't completely dissimilar to this, although it would basically take the average of the schools that are in your district, that's in the area or whatever. The problem is that it killed the small private schools, like the private schools with 100 kids. Let's say there are 2 private schools. I'll give you an example in Springfield that have, one has just under 100, one has around 100 and I don't know 60 or whatever. They would be 4A with 160 kids. It wouldn't affect football, but so if you make this football specific, that actually changes it a little bit. And maybe that's where the next thing where they need to do is because these schools, like in volleyball, they'd be 4A. In baseball, they'd be 4A, despite the fact they have 150 kids versus a team that has 1,500 or 2,000 or whatever in their high school. So that was the one problem they had with that proposal. It really hammered those schools. But if none of those schools of 100 kids have football, or if they do, they co-op, and then you got to decide, okay, do we really want to co-op? So if you make it football specific, it can change things. But I think that there has to be something done. But that would be my hesitation on that one.
Proposal 2 is one that's done very similarly down here in Texas. If you have a no boundary school, the zip code of your players, whichever player lives in a zip code with the biggest school, that becomes your enrollment. Let's say Bloomington Central Catholic. If you had a player that could have went to Normal Community, which is the biggest school in that area, Central Catholic would be 7A. That would be a brutal way of doing it for some schools. Although there were years, now not very recently, but there were years where Bloomington Central Catholic, when I was growing up in the 80s, they were a machine with John McIntyre, and they did have some of the best players from Bloomington and Normal Community and other areas, schools. And I would assume Sacred Heart Griffin probably has quite a few kids from around the Springfield area as well.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. So you'd move those schools up. It's a similar proposal in that regard. You take a Roland Large school. How about this? I said this one time. Why don't we take the private schools and every school you pull from? So the weird part about it, think about this. If you co-op with the school and you have one kid that plays from that school, you have to count every kid that goes to that school.
Yes.
But if you take a kid from a school at a private school, he counts as one kid. So you want to change this for all sports. Make it when you co-op, you just you got your school plus however many kids come from that school to play at your sport. That would change things a lot, wouldn't it? So that would be another way to do this. I don't know. It seems like this one is probably going to be tough again because of the way it would hammer a school. Like if you are in Bloomington Central Catholic, or if you're a Lutheran, Springfield Calvary, Champaign, St. Thomas More, and you have to be like a 7 or 8A school just because you got a kid from there. So it'd be tough.
Now, the third one's even tougher. This is the one that's probably the least likely. This is where you just cumulative if you got kids from 7 different schools, you add up all their enrollment, And that's where you end up at that
Yeah.
cumulative. So that one, I don't think that one has a no starter.
Is there an idea to average that then? That's another one.
You could
Throw
certainly average, which would be very similar to picking the largest one, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So the average, maybe throw out the smallest and the largest and average then. I don't know. And then that would be interesting, but it would be closer. But I
Yeah.
think your proposal 4 is the one that probably makes the most sense
Yes.
out of these 4.
Yes, and so for me, separate them, and you have the no boundaries schools, and you have the public schools with boundaries. 6 classes of teams in the boundaries. So for football, that would be like it was when we grew up with six A's, and then you would have 2 classes of no boundary teams. But before I listen to people whine, like, oh, there's just too many schools. That's the way basketball was for 70 years. So you can have 2 classes because there's a lot less schools playing football in the private sector than there were the whole state of Illinois that was divided up into 2 classes for basketball. So for me, I would tend to go a little bit of either 1 or 4, and that would be how I would do it.
Yeah, I think 4 makes a lot of sense. You look at this and you look at all these schools and you see how they get broken up. And there are a lot of big schools, 7A, 8A, but I really think when you look at these enrollments and you look at how you could maybe make it better, do think this could really work. It, having the 6 and 2. Now, the other thing I said before we go trying to reinvent the wheel, why not just make all of them use the multiplier right away? Just immediately say, hey, we're going to make sure we're not going to give any multiplier waivers. You're going to take 1.65 times your enrollment. That's what they decided years ago, but somehow they got that so they could waive it. If you do that, you're going to move those classes. Belleville Altoff wins 1A. How much better would they have been? How much more would have made sense if they were in 3A or 4A? That would have made sense, right? Maybe you take the 4As and they're up in 5 and 6A, and that makes more sense. They're against teams in East St. Louis or whatever. Joliet Catholic in 5A. They should probably be in 6A. That's who they play against during the season. Chicago DePaul, move them up. Montini, move them up. And you start getting these games, I think they'd be more competitive. And the other thing you would see is some of the 2A schools would move up. Now, here's the other part about this. I also feel we have this success factor for this and where they move up a class if they win it for private schools. Okay, and that's fine. I also think why not move up for public schools? Move up a class. You win, move up a class. At the end of the day, we have put too much on winning and not on competing against the best teams. Like our school, where I coach at, we're 2A in softball. So we had to obviously 2A in softball is really good. Has really good competition. Rockridge and some of these schools that we've run into are fantastic. But we could go down to we were borderline 1A, 2A for a long time, and I don't know that I'd feel any different. I'd rather win the regional in 2A or win a sectional in 2A than I would in 1A, because to me that was like more of not saying it's not a big deal to win in 1A. It's just, why would you not? If you can compete at that level, you should compete at that level. You know what I mean? And it's not always about winning. I think sometimes it's all about winning for these guys. It's, oh, we won this. Well, step up. Let's play the next class up and see what we can do. If we're 4A, we win it in 4A. Let's try 5A. Let's see what we can do. Because
Well,
it's the same programs year after year.
it seems like if you had the teams bracketed properly, the multipliers would be less important. And so I don't know. I can see why the IHSA is hesitant to split them, because
Yeah.
they don't want a private school a PIHSA that would be formed to run those. And I can see where they would be like, we don't want
I'm
that
pretty sure
competition.
they think that would happen. You know what I mean? I'm pretty sure they feel like the private schools would just form their own.
Yeah, which is why they probably haven't split them off.
But
At
here's the
some
thing:
point,
all this would take right here, right now, I think there's enough just craziness. If you had one corporate sponsor, let's say, and they sponsor, I guess, isn't Country Companies the big sponsor for the IHSA and all their basketball stuff?
a lot of it, yep.
So State Farm should just come in and say, you know what? we're going to buy out and we're going to have the basketball tournament. We're going to have it. We're going to host it. We're going to run it with all public schools. And just the public schools just go here and say that would take the cash cow away from this, from the IHSA. They could sponsor the football, they could sponsor it, whatever, and they could host it at a different stadium. And you could do it, and they could get it done right away. And I think the only thing it would do is make the IHSA realize that they need to change. And right now they don't think they need to change because they have money and they make money, and so it's all good. And really, that's what it's all about, even though it probably should be more about finding a competitive balance, which I definitely don't see from the IHSA.
Especially with, you look at the 1A game, and you look at Lena Winslow as a team that can generally play with anybody, and they look like a junior high team out there. And that's when people get hurt. And that's, again, there are years that you run into super teams, and Lena's given their share of butt kickings to people, but not quite what we saw across the board on this last weekend. And there have been other years. I didn't want to go into too much detail on it, but there have been other seasons, other years that you saw that where you just had a lot of those teams win state titles. It was very rarely do you see the public schools who are so good over a period of time, like what Cully Welter has done wherever he's been, whether it's been in Aledo or Monticello, or what's being done down in Lena Winslow. And those guys, they look like they got annihilated.
Yeah, the weird part about it is, for me, is Belleville Altoff. Rochester was 4A, and they used to play Belleville Altoff constantly in the playoffs. That was like the big game, and they continue to build a legacy. And now Altoff's in 1A? That just makes no sense. At some point, common sense should rule, but we always back ourselves in a corner where common sense can't rule. You know what I mean?
Altoff playing against somebody up in 4A probably would have been a fantastic game.
Yeah.
And those guys, it would have been a heck of a lot prouder of a medal that they've got from that. I used to feel for the kids at Pontiac. They had some incredible teams under Peterson, and they were just really good for a single city. And then they'd go have to play Joliet Catholic, and they would play them close, which was amazing. They'd play them to one score with guys like the Buccaneers, Mike Allstott, but they just couldn't get over the hump. And you're thinking that those 4A Pontiac teams may have been some of the best single town teams, but they never got there because they had to go play against Chicago's Suburban All-Star team.
Yeah, it's tough. And that's a different animal, right? There's a different animal when you play a Chicago Suburban All-Star team, basically, that can recruit and bring players in. The other thing I'd love to see take away, you want to have the multiplier, don't give any scholarships. Don't give any of these kids scholarships to these private schools. And people say, we don't give athletic scholarships. They do. And stop with don't lie. We all know it happens. I was talking to this kid. I was like, I knew the family, and I was talking to a kid, and I won't say who it was, but I said, how do you guys afford to this? I know you guys were talking tight because they had played in an organization and all this stuff. And I know times are just tough for you. Well, we don't pay anything. It's $10,000 a year private school. They don't pay anything. So don't tell me that there aren't scholarships. Is it need-based? Just so happens the need-based scholarships go to kids who happen to be really athletic, right? So just coincidence.
Well, yeah, they need it. But you didn't say whether it was the school or the family.
Yeah. I guess both needed it.
Folks, that was Brad Sturdy. Obviously, I wanted to get some feedback on this. This will be fun. We'll put it out there for people to take a look at. And we saw I started a mini storm on Twitter this weekend by getting frustrated by some of the games. And I just think that if they had 4 or 5 proposals and you get some smart people in a room, they can figure out tweaks and maybe a whole new idea that this would lead to them thinking of that would allow for a better result and be better for the kids involved. I know it's crazy to talk about the kids involved, but maybe it would be good for them too.
Yep.
So with that, folks, we will let you go. Thanks to Brad Sturdy, and thank you for watching. Until next week, keep moving forward.